Okay, we're going to cap up our CSS performance videos looking at the refactor of the big CSS file. I mentioned in the last video about CSS in JS that you don't get that. They're scoped, and so it means you can kind of quite easily remove your CSS with the component. But most websites generally have the old-fashioned big CSS file, which over years people have added to and taken bits out, and suddenly you're scared of it. It's big, you know most of it's unused, but you can't work out what or how to actually move forward or make it more performant. It's a big issue, but it's also one that's really hard to actually assess and solve. There are hundreds of tools out there which claim they can find all your unneeded CSS. Among them is the Lighthouse plugin, which I think you just run it on your page, but it will basically just look at your CSS rules, look at your HTML, and then just tell you which ones are being actively applied and not. But obviously that doesn't tell the whole story. You'd have to start recording, then make sure you hit all of your media queries. So resize your browser to small to big, but there might be some that are more based on device type or some other settings in your page. So it's not going to trigger all the CSS rules for those things. It could be that you need to view all the states. You need to open up modal, set things to active, see the success and errors states. You need to fill out forms. You need to basically do everything on your application. And obviously most of the time these CSS files cover all the pages of your application. So you've got to log in and click through all the pages, all the states, view something, add it, remove it, delete it. You've got to kind of do all the things in order to see which CSS rules are being applied. And even then you're going to miss some. There might also be situations where you want it to be like that. You might have a kind of grid system. So you've got lots of classes about different widths you want to keep, or icons in which you kind of want to keep 30 classes about defining different icons. Your analysis tool is going to tell you don't need those, they're not used, but you kind of do want to keep them there. You've also got to consider if your application is built on some sort of PHP, .NET environment where the HTML files are not just these little kind of view files that you can easily look through. If your notion was, I'm just going to go through the CSS file, I'll just, for each class name, I'll just do a search throughout the code base and find if I'm using the rule or not. The trade-off there, of course, is if it's being added on some server-side view file, it's not being added, it's not going to be something you can easily track down and find. Similarly, it might be if you've got a class that's kind of like notification-success, notification-error, but you're not going to be able to find those classes because of the way they're actually built, and your file is on some sort of for loop that's notification-status variable or something. So you're not going to be able to easily just search for each class and find them and remove them. For this reason, people generally just become scared of changing anything because you inadvertently break stuff. You also need the new system up front, so if you hate that you are using the bootstrap grid system and you want to move to your own CSS grid solution, you're going to need to refactor out hundreds of classes. You don't want to just basically like for like swap them over to whatever you want to use. You kind of want to create something more succinct, something that suits your actual website rather than just borrowing from a library. So you can't just take that out and replace it. You kind of need to build the new one in place and then kind of work out what everything maps to in order to come over. And you might still be tied to a convention. If that's a 12-column grid, you can't now just switch to your one, which is going to be percentage-based without any of those numbers until you've kind of worked out what the mapping rule is. So sometimes there's a lot of homework ahead of time just before you get started. So it's going to have to be done by gradations. You're going to have to make regular, consistent changes of moving a few classes at a time. That way you've got the lowest risk of breaking a page somewhere. If you've got some kind of useful screenshot tool that's going to do some diffs for you, either some automated process or even just taking your own manual screenshots, that will help you at least spot any big wholesale changes, like any big padding drop-offs or things moving. Again, there's the trouble of, can you simulate every single state and every single view of everything? No, and those things are going to be one of those risks you take, and you just try to make an assessment ahead of time of where this thing is being used and how much you're likely to affect anything, but it is a bit of a manual process. It's easier generally to roll forward on these things. So if you have an idea of what your ideal solution would be, if you change something and then some sort of style bug visual issue happens, it might be easier to sort of say, okay, and we'll fix that too. It means rather than kind of having your refactor as something on the side, you're going to be actively able to kind of progress and find issues and solve those, and that will spur on more changes and help you move towards that goal of whatever your ideal new solution and reduce CSS is. You know, there could also be a browser or mobile that suddenly has an issue after a change, or it could be an unrelated ticket. You just have some bug has come up on a browser or an issue, and at that point you see, well, here's the fix, but it's also a chance for us to use our new classes or our new system, and we can increment these things. So again, rather than the the refactor being this kind of side thing which is unrelated to any other work you're doing. There might just be opportunities to do upgrades and refactors where you see fit. For that, having a ready-made solution is better. So if you're deciding we're going to shift from this big library or these kind of messy conventions to we're going to strictly use this type naming convention, or we're using utility classes or any of these things, if you've got that in place, obviously, if you've got your tightly defined thing, it's easier to shift. Like this thing can be got rid of or this thing can be refactored to work with this. Obviously, that's better than just moving to nothing. You're just refactoring for the sake of it, of this should now just be this because of my preference. But also you're going to be able to spot the patterns. So again, moving from that grid system of this uses column 4 medium and column 6 medium, well that's our equivalent of like half width and small width, or that's our equivalent of a 50% or whatever. You're going to be able to spot where the patterns are and spot where certain kind of conventions were used in one and how they kind of have similarity. So having at least one ideal goal you're going to move towards is going to help with every refactor. When you're removing something, you can easily strip things out, but also move a few things over. And you'll even spot where there's duplications, where you'll see lots of places where a lot of the similar classes are made. You know, we know what our chosen solution is for that is, so we can now kind of get rid of the others. If you're using SAS or some preprocessor for a lot of these rules, it might be worth revisiting what that's doing, just because a modern CSS might have caught up. The obvious one is variables. If you're using lots of variables for things, there are now native CSS variables which have their own perks. You might find that variable actually isn't massively needed. Like it was actually only used in 1 or 2 places and it can just be dropped in. But you might find it works better as a CSS variable and that gives you more control. But also mixins. Obviously mixins are like little functions. They're able to kind of calculate things, do this or this. Usually you give a value and it will kind of wrap that in a different way. A lot of that might now be leverageable from custom properties. Obviously custom properties are not just these strings you can just keep like red, blue, keep font sizes, but they can be all kinds of values that can then be chained together and calculated. So you can define what the active color is, but then scope that to different classes, or you can kind of reuse that property in lots of places. It might be there are lots of mixins now which can actually be solved quite simply with some custom properties being chained together. And in all, if you can refactor out your mixins, not only will you reduce your CSS, you'll be able to move away from a preprocessor to just using regular CSS and maybe make your CSS more easy to manage and work with because if you know directly what changes you're making. Obviously one solution as well is to just move to CSS in JS. It might be that if you're about to start a new project or you're about to move away from an old-fashioned website to some sort of JavaScript solution, you might make that decision of say, well, we're not just going to carry over the CSS file. Everything we build will be new and everything will be coupled and scoped. That way you're kind of, it's not a case of going through and slowly removing line by line thing you don't need. You just kind of get to the point where we'll just keep building in a new environment until we're ready to just kill this off altogether. And that's the big hit solution you could go for. Again, it's about what your particular circumstances are and what suits. But the thing just to note is that it can be done. And you do just need a kind of good strategy and process for doing. But also there's a kind of cumulative benefit. So once you've got a clear goal of what it is you're aiming for and also what things you're reducing, every time you fix something, every time you reduce some CSS, you're going to start seeing the perks of that. And it starts to become easier to work on tickets because you're able to easily know what CSS needs to be applied. You've got a great deal more confidence that it's the correct structure for you and that it's going to be easier to find the right class and know exactly what you're changing. So there's over time, the more you implement your new system, you're going to be able to reduce that CSS down, which feels nice, but also you're going to be able to work a lot quicker and more efficiently because you know you're kind of reducing your scoping risks and you know with confidence what you're removing is not going to have any impact. That kind of wraps up the CSS performance videos I wanted to do with the kind of important metrics, how you can make your site more optimal, what CSS values you can use, CSS and JS, and then refactoring things down. I'll include some more links here, but it's always a really interesting topic, so any comments welcome. Go off and have a lovely day.